Hey everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us for this panel on incivility and how online behavior can interrupt our connection with our audiences. Hopefully we're going to talk about some thoughts around that and some cool ideas and solutions for how we handle it. I'm Melissa Inman. I am the VP of Content Strategy and Operations for Meredith Corporation. So I oversee teams across our country and across our brands who are creating digital content for our brands and also handle our social media accounts. So I'm joined by three panelists that I will introduce here today. So first up is Lolly Bowean. Lolly's a general assignment reporter for the Chicago Tribune who has a particular focus on urban affairs, youth culture, housing, minority communities, and government relations. She writes primarily about Chicago's unique African-American community and the development of the Obama Presidential Center. She's a member of the National Association of Black Journalists and is the former program officer of the Chicago Headline Club. Lolly was a 2017 Neiman Fellow at Harvard University and a Stutz Terkel Award winner, and she's a Pulitzer nominated writer who's a finalist for the Jean Bird Award for Urban Journalism. Thank you, Lolly. Next up, we have Karla Armendariz. Born and raised on the U.S.-Mexico border in West Texas, Karla knows firsthand the reality of living in a bilingual, bicultural world. She received her double major in communications with an emphasis in journalism and Spanish from the University of the Incarnate World in San Antonio, Texas. Karla and her marketing partner currently serve as the Hispanic advertising agency for White Castle Restaurants and Lakeview Farms, both headquartered in Ohio, and she's helped many other top brands establish themselves in the Hispanic marketplace, including Denny's Restaurants, Nissan, Daimler Chrysler, Toyota, Subaru, and Rent-A-Center. Thank you, Karla. Thank you. And certainly last but not least, we have Rob Yarin, who is Vice President of Content for Cox Media Group, overseeing strategic content implementation for all of CMG's media properties. Rob is responsible for CMG's National Content and Distribution Center, the Washington News Bureau, and digital analytics team. In addition, he leads a variety of CMG initiatives, including OTT strategy and research. So thank you very much to all of them. All right, I wanted to kick things off today with just a little bit of sort of background on, I think, what got us here. When I was first approached with the idea of moderating this panel, I have to admit that I hadn't really given the idea of incivility that much thought. I think we all sort of know that dealing with our audiences in an online space is a really challenging thing, and we've all probably come up with policies in our own organizations to deal with that or had our own experiences and how we're going to handle it, but I hadn't really done that much research, so I did a little. So some things that I found out. A 2017 Pew Research Center survey of more than 4,000 U.S. adults found that 41% of Americans have been personally subjected to harassing behavior online, and an even larger share, 66%, have witnessed these behaviors directed at others. Earlier this year, the Center for Media Engagement released the results of a study that looked at how uncivil comments affect perception of a news site and ways that journalists can address the problem. Based on the results, they summarized that people who viewed stories with only uncivil comments had less positive attitudes toward the site itself and saw it as less valuable compared to those who saw stories with only civil comments. Those who saw uncivil comments also felt less loyal to the site and less similar to the commenters. And the Pew study determined that even those who didn't experience direct harassment feel the effects. So 27% of Americans say that they have decided not to post something online after witnessing the harassment of others, while more than 1 in 10, 13%, say they have stopped using an online service after witnessing others engage in harassing behaviors. So it seems very clear that online audience behavior can impact our ability to reach our audiences. And the goal of this session is to explore how important that audience communication is and how we can facilitate a free exchange of ideas in a challenging environment. So first up, panelists, do we all agree that we as media professionals have a responsibility to provide a safe, harassment-free environment in which our audiences can express their opinions on the work that we do? Lolly?
Oh, absolutely. First, let me just thank everyone for coming to this panel and express my thanks for being invited here to talk about this really timely and important topic. So one of the first things that comes to my mind when it comes to audiences is that for our career field, we have to have our audiences, right? So we depend on them in supporting our products, particularly as reporters. We are dependent on our audience to not only read and consume the news, but we understand that they want to engage with us. They want to engage with us as reporters. They want to engage with us to understand the depth of what we're writing about, and they want more access and to feel connected to us as reporters. So now we absolutely have a responsibility that when we open up a forum, not only for journalists and for people who work in the news industry to engage with the public, we have a responsibility to also manage how they engage with each other. So when we open up, for example, the chat boxes or the commentary boxes under our stories, we definitely have a responsibility to make sure that the public, as they engage with each other, are doing that in a very civil, organized manner.
Great. Would you like to add anything, Karla?
No, I think Lolly is right. I think we do have that responsibility. I think once as reporters or marketers, the minute a brand gets out there and starts tapping this target, you are expected to then in return communicate once, after that and talk to this consumer that you will continue to be in contact once you have that first contact. So I think those are things we have to prepare ourselves for even before getting ourselves out there mentally, what this will entail in the future and what the possibilities will be of becoming exposed to our target or our consumers.
Great.
Hi, so thanks for having me here. So yes, I agree. But I guess I would ask, first, or I would say, providing that safe haven is difficult, very difficult. And understanding what is incivility, I think, is part of the problem because there's a wide range. I mean, if I said right now, go Hawkeyes, am I being uncivil? And if I said it over and over and over again, would I really be uncivil? So can I take a second to read Facebook's policy?
Absolutely.
So here's how Facebook is trying to provide a safe haven, and make your own judgments on whether or not they're effective. Our community is global and diverse. Our policies may seem broad, but that is because we apply them consistently and fairly to a community that transcends regions, cultures, and languages. As a result, our community standards can sometimes appear less nuanced than we would like, leading to an outcome that is at odds with their underlying purpose. For that reason, in some cases, and when we are provided with additional context, we make a decision based on the spirit rather than the letter of the policy. Just as an editorial comment, whenever you have 4 parentheticals in a sentence, I think it shows that they're struggling. Just one more paragraph. Everyone on Facebook, meaning everyone here who's on Facebook and anyone who's on Facebook, plays a part in keeping the platform safe and respectful. I'll stop there, but the idea on these social platforms is that it's the responsibility of the community to report this, and that's what creates some of the difficulty. And we can get into the discussion. It's not that way when you look at other forms of media, such as broadcast television, which is regulated. So if you look at offensive language, for example, you don't get that uncivility in terms of offensive language on broadcast that you might on the internet.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. And it's a point that I wanted to make sure that we surfaced, and I'm going to jump to that now. I think it would be good to talk a little bit about how social media channels are trying to combat harassment and bullying with technology solutions. So real quickly, I wanted to talk about 2, and then talk about how we then leverage those tools and what responsibility we have in the space as well. So one that I wanted to mention is this new release from Instagram. So this July, they started rolling out a new feature that's using AI to scan the content of comments and notify people before their comment is even posted, that it may be considered offensive. And so according to the Instagram blog, they say this intervention gives people a chance to reflect and undo their comment and prevents the recipient from receiving harmful comment notifications. From early tests of the feature, they found that it encourages some people to at least undo their comment and share something less hurtful once they've had a chance to reflect. And then another one is from Facebook. And Facebook last fall really sort of was working on beefing up its anti-harassment policy and protections, and they rolled out a set of tools to help page moderators deal with inappropriate comments on posts. So the idea is that it helps you get rid of negative comments, like moderators of pages can get rid of negative comments more easily and also protect the community from exposure to them. According to Facebook, they're also testing more ways to easily search for and block offensive words from appearing in comments. So they rolled out a feature that allows you to report harassing behavior on behalf of someone else, too. So if you see someone being attacked in comments, even if that person hasn't seen it, you can report them. So I do want to open up for discussion. How much of the responsibility to encourage civil discourse around our content lies with us versus the platforms on which many of the conversations happen?
Well, I think there's multiple entities that should be responsible for this. I think probably the government or the state or the legislation has some responsibility to maybe set some of those laws forward. You know, I think this social media thing, nobody expected it to be this big, and maybe if they did not expect for it to come to this. And so it's like when you start a company, you have 3 employees, so you don't have any rules or you don't have a handbook, but then you have 20 employees and it's, things start getting different. And so, okay, now I have to set the rules or set some regulations. So I think this is where it grew too fast and maybe the right tools weren't in place or the right rules. So I think legislation, government has some responsibility there. And then I think the social media platforms, of course, as well have some responsibility and have to do their part, whether it's something like this or whatever it might need to be. And then us as the media or the advertisers take on some of our responsibility to the degree that each of the entities can. So I think it's a shared responsibility and not just us as the media or anyone else. So I do believe that.
I think it's a tough question to answer, so I'm going to punt and answer both ways.
Great.
So I do think that it is the social media platforms responsibility to provide the tools to be able to help monitor commenting and monitor incivility, as we're calling it. They do so much with their platforms that they're in control of, that on the one hand I want to say it should be their responsibility, but we are voluntarily deciding to be on their platforms. So in that regard, it seems like we would have some responsibility to at least monitor those comments or use the tools that we're provided with to make sure that we are monitoring them.
Great. Lolly, anything to add?
So for me, I enter this conversation from multiple directions. There's the direction from being a reporter who is out interviewing people and producing stories about people, citizens in their lives, and certain issues. So as a person who produces stories, I am the author of a lot of conversations, or the originator of conversations that occur in the public. That's our role as a media organization. This then encourages conversation in multiple ways. There are people that come directly to chicagotribune.com to have those conversations under the stories. So as a person who is producing these stories, I have to be responsible as a reporter to make sure that we are managing the conversation, not only between me as the reporter and the public, but again, between the public and each other. Sometimes that has meant before we post the story, having conversations about how we want to allow the readers to give feedback, particularly on sensitive topics or topics that have to do with poverty, race, or gender, things that we know can stir the pot, so to speak, that can solicit comments from the public that can be potentially abusive. So we decide where we're going to have this conversation. Are we going to open up the comments on the chicagotribune.com page? When we open up the comments on that page, then it is absolutely our responsibility to make sure that the comments that roll in from a story are not abusive, that they are not uncivil, that they are not attacking each other or offensive to our audience, because those comments, as you have said in your presentation, could then discourage our reach. So at times, we've made the decision early on that this is a story we're going to make available to the public, but they're not going to be able to allow comments on our website. One of the virtues of journalism is accountability. So we can shift the conversation from our site, where people can comment anonymously, to Facebook specifically, where they have to comment with accountability by making sure their name and their face accommodates their comments. So that's one of the ways that we manage the conversation, so that you can't hide behind an avatar or behind being anonymous, that the public will then have to engage in a conversation on this platform where their identity is made available to the rest of the people that they are commenting to and about. And so that's kind of the approach that we take as a news organization, is this platform is where we can manage it. On Facebook, where they have different standards that Rob has shared for us, they have their standards, but the one thing that they do have that we value is that accountability, that you have to have a profile and a photograph to be held accountable for your comments.
Lolly packed a ton into that answer. All sorts of things that I want to make sure we talk about. So one of the things that Lolly really brought up as we were doing the prep for this, and that she touched on here, was sort of that understanding how what we're producing is going to affect the audience that's seeing it even before it gets posted, and being able to anticipate those responses. So Rob, Karla, is there anything else that you want to add on that point? In terms of how we're anticipating our audience response to things that we're posting?
Well, I would say from what we've seen, and some of it, was in the keynote, was addressed, is in some of the reporting, what is important to the users or readers in terms of things like accuracy and whether or not it creates, incivility if we're not accurate, if we're focusing on issues just for the sake of focusing on issues that are divisive. I just wrote some notes.
Are we talking clickbait?
Correct. Yeah, things like clickbait, and there are things like crime generally does really well, and we try to at least report crime in a way that has some meaning to the community or has some value or some takeaways, and so that's difficult. We did research on trust and skepticism in the media, and the things that were most important were being fact-checked, telling the whole story, and like the keynote speaker said, admitting when you're wrong. And I think that we saw that the same thing too. If you make a mistake, say that you're wrong. In the second tier was diverse perspectives. Mm-hmm. And that's something too that I think is important in this conversation as well.
Yeah, and Karla, I think that's something that we sort of said you might be able to touch on and give some perspective on too, in terms of understanding those diverse perspectives.
Right, absolutely. I think, coming from the marketing or advertising side, sometimes it's probably easier to know who our target will be and who it is, because before we even put out a message, we research our target, we find out everything we possibly can about our target. And so by the time we put the message out, we're already probably touched on things that they probably think are great for them or are right for them, and that we know at least we're going to touch the right button. So that helps us do that. By doing that research, that helps us prepare better for it. And you really have to, I think, the way people react really has to do a lot with many things, whether it's a generational thing or with a race issue or so you really have to know who your target is, at least from our perspective, and that's how we know how, or at least can be prepared for a response or questions or any dialogue that we're going to get, because we know who that target really is. When I look at it from the Hispanic perspective, it's really about a lot of the older generation Hispanic consumers. They are very much non-confrontational. We know that probably if we're targeting them or a brand or a product that's going directly to them, we're probably not going to get a lot of dialogue from them because they tend to be, like I said, non-confrontational. They don't want to have any issue or anything or just bring anything up. So we know that would probably be something low-key. But then when we start looking at millennials or even Gen Zs, we know that there's going to be some dialogue, whether unhappy dialogue or good dialogue, or complain about, this brand not catering to me, or you guys have it all wrong, that sort of thing. So it really is about, from, again, I think the marketing perspective, it helps to know and research your target before, and that really preempts to what might come our way.
And Rob, you guys have done some of that too in some of your own studies around sort of perceptions around news, and even looking at how different groups of people perceive news sources, correct?
Yeah, and I think that question goes to, I was raised earlier, as to whether or not there's people even trust the media to be the arbiters of incivility. And so our research shows that conservatives generally are much less trusting of the media. And one of these key factors that was important when choosing a news source was being unbiased. So our research showed that on an 8 to 10 scale, where 10 was very skeptical, social media was the least trusted. Conservatives, 62%, 52% of liberals were skeptical. But then the gap starts to grow wider as you go down the scale. So online news, 45% of conservatives were skeptical, 26% of liberals. National news on broadcast and cable, 41% of conservatives were skeptical, 15% of liberals were very skeptical. And even local news broadcast, TV, which was the most trusted out of all of them as a whole, the split was 32-9, conservatives versus liberals. So there's definitely different perceptions of the media. And I don't think it's surprising, given what's been written.
And that changes the approach that your teams are taking as they're creating content, or does it better prepare them for how to handle the response once something is shared?
Well, I think it's some of both, but probably the former first. So we try to be very careful, especially digitally, in how we're reporting, to make sure we're reporting both sides. And it is very tough in today's world, because sometimes no matter what you do and what you report, you are you're going to be seen as being one-sided. And you have to be careful not to report what others are saying. And we had a situation with a tweet by the president that was being labeled as I forget what the exact adjective was, and we repeated that in one of the stories, and we pulled it back and changed the story because it was an adjective that was that everybody did not agree with in terms of how they viewed that tweet.
Got it. One of the other things that I want to go back to is something else that Lolly brought up, which is commenting on our own sites. So Lolly, you mentioned making sort of selective choices around which stories on your site are going to be open for public commenting. in doing a bunch of sort of, again, some research before this, I sort of took a look around. There's a number of notable sites who, have pulled commenting function from their own sites because they didn't want to have to manage those conversations or be held liable for them in a number of cases. And it looked like the Chicago Tribune has pulled commenting function in general from most stories on site, and it looked like maybe Cox Media had taken that approach as well. Can you guys talk a little bit about that and sort of how that approach, does that approach limit our ability to communicate with audiences, and then how do we solve for that?
So first, to be transparent and clear, I was not a part of the decision-making for the sort of broad approach to closing comments. And we have not closed all comments. Again, that we've shifted the ability to comment either through logging in from Facebook, and that was an attempt so that the audience would kind of self-regulate themselves because they're being held accountable through their profile. And so we've shifted the conversation through other platforms. So the decision is normally made story by story based on what we anticipate. And some of that is just kind of based subjectively based on what we have seen from previous stories about that topic. Initially, the conversation about comments was first, we want to hear what our readers have to say about our stories, particularly if they're commenting about the story itself and the content that's within the story. We definitely want to have a conversation about that. What we don't want, and unfortunately this is what has happened all too often in the comment board, is for some members of the public to essentially hijack this technology as a way of either A, starting their own conversation. So your story is about balloons, and they come into the comments and they're talking about Trump. Right? It has nothing to do with the story itself, but now they're using a national platform in order to elevate their own individual conversation. And now there's a completely separate dialogue that's happening, or a conversation that's happening in the comments that we can't control. And we want to be careful, one, that we're not allowing our brand, our audience reach, our reputation to be sacrificed because someone wants to come in and take over, right? And that's the unfortunate part that these comment boards and even social media has allowed, is that you have a national brand like Cox, and Cox is thoughtful. Cox is being decisive and thinking ahead of time. And then you have someone who just comes in and then tries to use your access to millions of people or thousands of people to then push an agenda of their own. So that was part of the reason why we had to kind of be careful about folding in. But then it gets even more complicated and dimensional, right? Because you don't want to, once people start having this conversation, you don't want to delete that conversation, because now you're taking away the recording of it first, and that's our job, is to record history, to record what people are saying. Two, you also don't want to shut down people's First Amendment right of being able to speak. So that was part of why we have to be very thoughtful and decisive ahead of time on how we are going to allow a conversation to happen about this, right? And by shifting it to a social media platform like Facebook, again, it allows for that accountability, but it also allows for a dual way that conversation can take place about the story. So again, the story is about balloons. You can comment with accountability on our Chicago Tribune Facebook page, or you can take the story to your own page and engage a conversation more privately among your Facebook community or among your Twitter community. And in many ways, we're not responsible for the conversation that takes place on your own forum. We're responsible for the conversation and the way that our brand, our name, and our reputation is being used.
That's great. Rob? Oh, sorry.
People that-
Yeah. Questions? Yeah.
Questions already.
Sure. We were going to open it up to Q&A, but we absolutely can. So let's do it now. If I can figure out how to turn these on, just in case. Oh, great. Okay.
So I really love your comments on the brand personality. I was at Target a couple years ago at their kind of hub center of social media and asked the same question. Who has the responsibility to go into this discussion and respond from either the corporation or the news media? And, you know, this isn't something you want to put your corporate reputation out there with an intern answering the questions, but yet you don't want to have a senior vice president who maybe is the most responsible voice for the company spending their time monitoring Facebook comments. So how do you actually implement this as far as monitoring and deciding what should be deleted, what's hate speech, what is just inappropriate, it's off topic? Who actually makes those decisions and can speak for the company?
Does any of you want to address that, or?
Well, and by the way, I have your check later, and thanks for the kind words about Cox. No, actually, you know, and that's the thing I think from, and I'll answer your question in a second. I think as local media, first we disabled our comments it's been several years, so we have no commenting on our sites. And I would say that doesn't mean we don't engage with the community, just the opposite. I was not involved in that decision. I'm not sure I would think any differently today. To your point, and to the Facebook policy, it is really difficult to manage this, and that seems like a cop-out maybe to say, well, we're just not going to have commenting at all. I think we engage in the communities in other ways. I was, in my past history, I was involved in coming up with content standards for the wireless industry, and we reviewed tens of thousands of ringtones and wallpaper and all kinds of things. And it is a difficult job. And to your point, you really need to have policies that you can enforce. And then you could have a mid-level person or people that would then go over these and enforce those policies. And so we did that. It was an earlier day. But for example, things like you have to think about if you think about images, you have to think about a historical art exception, because otherwise you'll be removing things that should be on there and you'll get dinged if you remove them, and vice versa. So the point is, you could have mid-level people, as you're saying, do this, but you need a set of policies, and it's going to take a lot of discussion and time, and you got to be prepared for the backlash if you do something that is seen not to be correct.
And I could speak to it just a little bit from a Meredith standpoint. So, you know, we have a lot of brands. We have a lot of big brands, right? And each of those brands has a team assigned to manage the social media channels, but then and they sort of have their own code of conduct that they know which things they're going to permit on those channels and what they're not. And so they'll take a relatively mid-level person is able to make most of those decisions. Anything that seems to require escalation does get escalated, and then decisions are made more quickly by a more senior member of the team. I thought it was interesting when I was, again, doing some research here, how many media outlets still post on Facebook their code of conduct in terms of how they expect their page followers to behave. Not everyone does that anymore, but there are still quite a few out there, and I think it's something that probably more of us could return to. I think the other thing is, I think we all rely on our communities to police each other some, right? So I know when I look at comment threads on Facebook around content that we've posted, there's a lot of community moderation and people saying, you know, like, that's not relevant, stop being a hater, you know, we don't need to hear from this. I think the challenge with that is that all of that activity around a negative comment can make it surface even higher in the algorithm, and it can be the first thing that everyone sees. Right? So then comes the line of like, when do you respond to it, and when do you just sort of shut it down, and then are you infringing on someone's free speech, as Lolly brought up.
That's a great point about the code of conduct on pages, because when I did some searching last night on Google, I searched Facebook comment policy, and the first thing that comes up is a Facebook page for something called Oregon Trails, which has the code of conduct posted on there site.
Yeah,
And so
I think we did the
that's a good
same
point.
search. So I did a few of those too. And the ones that I was coming up with when I was really looking for like Facebook comment policy, I was coming up with, or Facebook code of conduct, I was coming up with a lot of individual brand pages that had established their own policies around that. And I think that's something we should be responsible for, right?
Yeah, it took me a while to find Facebook's policy.
Karla, did you have anything to add there? I don't.
No, I think from my perspective, it really depends on the company. If you have, I think, a Target, there's probably already a code of conduct, or there's probably a policy in place, which I think does need to happen, and every company should sit down, and it's not going to be an easy solution, but probably have one. But then we have these smaller companies who they've probably never, one, done Latino advertising or multicultural advertising, and two, are maybe even starting to just get into social media and this whole internet thing. So in those cases, we do talk to the top people in the company if it's a comment that we feel it's better coming from the vice president or what that might be. So we still have the liberty and the access to that. And as a brand, it's very hard to say this is where I stop, because as a brand, you'll want to please your consumer. You want to do the right thing. You want to address a comment or any comment. And typically when we can, and when there's a very bad comment or something, we want to address it right away before that escalates even more. A lot of people say, well, maybe just let it sit or let it wait, but we've got those brands where, okay, let's try to answer it as soon as it gets on there before it just escalates or more people start jumping in. Or if we need to take it offline, we take it offline in the extent or degree that we can with that person. But it really is a based on the company on a one-by-one basis, if you will, right now, because there's still so much learning.
I think that's a really good point. The way in which you handle those responses, right? It's keep it factual, keep it brief, and take it offline. Like, try and get them out of engaging in a long conversation in the comment threads, because that's not where you should be doing that. You want to make sure that anyone who sees it knows that you've addressed the issue, but you don't need to air everything in that thread.
And sometimes that's all they want, attention.
They just want attention.
And so if you take
wanna
it
know they're heard.
offline and now you're catering to them individually as a company, and they're actually surprised and grateful because you did that. So, you turned a bad situation into a good one. So it's just, I think it's a lot of learn as you go kind of thing for smaller companies.
I'm curious about the First Amendment implications here, because we're in a political climate where the First Amendment's under attack. Kansas State came out with a research study several years ago that said that people hide under the First Amendment for hate speech, right? Well, technically hate speech is, right, included under the First Amendment. So even if we're using the term incivility and you're talking about the comments and then removing comments, taking comments off pages, at what point do we get into, people starting to pull out the First Amendment and making threats against, lawsuits and things, because in some regard you are inhibiting elements of conversation, right? Elements of debate if you start making decisions on what you're going to keep and what you're going to take off. So how are you considering that element when you're making these decisions about, undoing comments and deleting things and not having them at all?
I know for us, and this may wrap both the questions into one, for us as reporters, we have a responsibility to engage with the public. We also have an appetite for public engagement, right? Just recently, a story of mine ran, and someone commented on a social media site that this is the reason why they don't read the newspaper is because of stories like mine. And I thought, well, thank you for reading, right? Because how would you know that this is why you stopped reading if you didn't read it, right? And so we need the public, we need them, and we have a strong appetite for those types of responses and remarks. I expect to get an inbox full of emails from the public when a story of mine runs. I'm ready to respond to all emails and to demonstrate civility to them. I am ready to comment in the comment boards and answer any questions that the public may have. What we want to be careful about is, again, allowing an individual to come into this space, come into this platform, and then hijack it for their own conversation. So we're not there to police what people think. We're not there to police the narrative or the stories that people want to tell. What we are there, though, is to protect the product that we have put forth and make sure that we don't allow them to then elevate their reach, because we're reaching more than 500,000 readers a day. So that's in part why we are careful about when we allow the comments on the page versus allowing them to have this discussion on their own page, right? They can have whatever conversation and they can say whatever they want to say in their own time and space, but not on our platform, because there's certain language based on our code of conduct that we won't stand behind. There's certain language and certain dialogues and phrases that we won't allow. And so you're absolutely right about going in and being selective about deleting comments. One of the things that we want to be careful about, or that we're very in tune and aware about, is that people also have the right to critique us and to criticize us, because again, we have the appetite for that. So if you find something about a story that you don't like, if you have things to say about how it was reported or written, I have the wherewithal to hear you, and I should hear you, right? And so we don't want to go into our comments and edit it selectively to make it appear that the public is responding one way when the public is actually responding in a different way. We have to be responsible in that sense. But in policing those comments, policing our Facebook feed, is to make sure that then this dialogue, this conversation, doesn't boil down to people attacking each other, or people calling names to each other, or people having a back and forth that has, again, nothing to do with the story that we've published. So we have to be really sensitive and address it in a case-by-case basis. One of the questions was, when does the top executives get involved versus an intern who's on social media? Again, it's a case-by-case basis for us as reporters. We're engaged because we're the ones who reported the story and wrote it. Our editors are engaged because they're also trying to follow the public conversation that has risen from what we've written. But the editors are also following and making decisions, too, on how we're going to engage a conversation with our public.
Would anyone else? Rob?
I just want to say that's why I think newspapers serve such a vital part in our society, and that kind of thoughtfulness and that kind of engagement is something, and even the willingness to be critiqued is, I think, something that's pretty unique to newspapers when you think about other media. And so there's a shout out.
Thank you. I'll have your check after.
A sincere shout out.
Well, I just wanted to point out to Lolly's comment about constructive criticism. We were actually working with a blog not too long ago, and we were talking about this, how bloggers even now have started to take off their comment section because they're getting these, or even bloggers on Instagram, that on their Insta stories you can put a comment when they have an Insta story. Well, now they start taking that out too, which is a shame, because that's how they grow their blogs and their business. But we were talking to a blogger and brainstorming how we could leave their comments section there, but she knows they're going to start getting the hate speech and the hate remarks and all of that. And I think we went back to advertising principles and Leo Burnett, if any of you are familiar, and it's about, we take constructive criticism, we take all the ideas, and so what we thought is on the comment section where it says comments and then colon and then you start writing, we actually did comments to the effect that respectful constructive criticism, etc., comments will be accepted or are accepted here. And so that way, if you start writing your hate speech or things there, then that we're already going to ignore that. That you've decided to put that out there, and we're not responding because we've already said that this is what we're expecting, this is what we anticipate. So I don't know if that's ever been done in the reporting field, and that's not going to stop people from putting things on there, but I think at least from her perspective, she's already said, this is what I will respond to, anything that falls within this category. So, that's...
I think that actually brings up something that I think has been an issue and sort of led to a lot of the comment sections being removed from sites, right? It's a heavy burden to do that moderation. So if you are going to say, I'm going to have comments on my site, you're taking a responsibility for the content being published there, and there have been a number of legal cases that say you are responsible for what's being published there, right? They assume that if you're going to allow things to be published, that you're also taking an active role in deciding what's being published on your site. So I wanted to touch real quickly on some tools maybe that allow publishers to handle moderation in a slightly easier way. One of the things that I thought was real interesting, and I don't know if you have seen this, is something called Perspective. So this comes from Jigsaw, which is a subsidiary of the Alphabet company, Google's holding company. And it's really a group devoted to policies and ideas. And they partnered with media sites like New York Times and Wikipedia to test and learn. But it's more recently even been used on sites like Reddit, which is all about people expressing their opinions, right? And has been incorporated into like the comments platform Disqus, which is something that a lot of sites use. And what they have done is sort of tried to determine a toxicity rating to comments. So individual sites or whoever's sort of running the comment system can sort of establish what toxicity level is sort of tolerated for the brand, sort of how fired up people can get. And then as comments are being entered, they're scored. And if you have a chance, go out and play with it. It's kind of fun. If you just Google Perspective or Jigsaw Perspective, and you can actually sort of try it out on the page, and it's very nuanced. So I can say things like, that's stupid, and it's fine with that. If I say, that's stupid and you're an idiot, it tells me I'm bordering on being maybe toxic. And it'll give it a score from 0 to 100. And you can start throwing in all sorts of things. I threw in some slang terms. I tried things like Trump lover. I tried libtard, some of the lovely terms that are being thrown around these days in social media. And it's starting to pick up on all those nuances. It's constantly learning, right? So it's an AI solution to being able to manage some of that better. I don't know if you want to talk at all about sort of the effort that it does take to moderate those things, though.
So yeah, I would just say AI is, in my mind, is kind of a misnomer because it's never automated entirely.
Mm-hmm.
It's
No,
never completely
No.
artificial. I mean, I call it managed AI because you still need someone. It's never perfect. In fact, I was at a Facebook conference earlier this year, and they showed the advances they're making in using AI to monitor conversations, and it still has a ways to go, and you can still end up with situations where you're removing content you shouldn't, and vice versa. So it is difficult, and as Melissa and I were talking before this panel, that the digital world today is so complex, and you have so many priorities and so many expenses and so many tools. It's difficult to think about, when you've done a situation where you've removed commenting, to then start putting it back. However, I would say the comments about selective commenting, and maybe if you make it a community effort, or there's a particular issue, and then you devote resources to it, that might be something that would be a good solution rather than just letting commenting go on every single story.
Yeah, I mean, a number of the Meredith brands, some of our news brands where people are sort of firing comments off more quickly, do have sort of active comments sections, and they do require live moderation, right? So we have a queue system where people can be able to sort of review all the comments as they're coming in. There's flagging for trigger words. There's profanity filters running through there, so those things sort of get filtered out. I remember many years ago when I worked more specifically on parents.com, though, that our profanity filters had a real problem with things that are very like commonplace in terms of female anatomy. That needs to be discussed in a parenting site. So, there's always those struggles, right? But on a number of our brands where the comments, it's not about news content, it's not about like a rapid fire of conversation, we do sort of put those things in through a moderation queue that's sort of moderated at a reasonable pace so that we can publish comments as appropriate too. All right. So even with tools in place, right, there's definitely times when you need to respond. I think we've already talked about that just a little bit, but I wondered if you guys could give any more advice or thoughts on how you decide when you're going to engage and sort of some of your rules for the road in engaging.
Well, for me, I again enter this conversation in multiple ways because my job entails that I engage with the public. So, for one, I choose to engage. I don't ignore. So anytime that I get an email or that I see comments, I try as aggressively as I can to respond. And one of the things that I do try to do is to demonstrate civility. So I understand that I have a platform to express my voice. For a lot of our audience, they only have their social media site. So when they decide to post something on a story, either in the comments or if they post something on a social media site, one of the first things I want to do is thank them for, one, reading the story, and then two, for feeling compelled to comment and engage with the content in some type of way. For me, that's my way of not only demonstrating a civil response to them and showing that I respect whatever it is that they have to say, but it also is my way of flagging to them that this is not just a name. There's a human being behind this email address, behind this story, and that I'm a person too. And sometimes just by saying, oh, well, thank you for reading the story and feeling compelled to respond, even a person who has posted a very hate-filled comment or something that has some very pointed language will then back away and say, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way. What I meant was this. So that's one of the ways, is just choose to engage versus to ignore or to delete. Secondly, I try to demonstrate civility by asking questions. So if a person makes a comment, then it allows me to open up a forum and ask them to explain a little bit more why you're having such an emotional reaction to this. For me, again, I have the privilege of that being a part of reporting. Sometimes what people have to say can lead me from the story that I've already written into a second story about a particular topic, right? So this then allows some reporting about that can then give me something else to put on our platform and elevate this person's voice if they are thoughtful. So one, do engage. Two, ask some questions. And if they are willing to engage in a civil conversation, then maybe you can move it offline and have an in-person conversation with them. One story that I did about a year ago was, as Mel said, I write about the Obama Presidential Center and the development of that center. It's caused a lot of controversy in Chicago as people fear that they'll be displaced once that center is built. One of the stories that I wrote that voiced these residents and their opinions then started a conversation from residents who didn't fear that they would be displaced, from residents who said, we really want this center because we want to see our property values increase, we want a place for our children to play, we want this in our neighborhood, something that's going to commemorate and honor the first African American president. Seeing those comments then led me to a second story on the same topic. It gave me the opportunity to provide a story from a different perspective perspective, and that kind of balanced out and counteracted that first story. So again, thirdly, start asking questions of the people who are engaging with your brand, engaging with your stories, engaging with your comments, because it could take you to a whole nother story or a whole nother way to kind of sell yourself to the public.
Great. Anything to add, Rob, Karla?
I would just say our engagement is, I know the title of this is civility. Our engagement is less about combating incivility and more about connecting with the community. And so when we had Hurricane Dorian over the weekend, particularly our stations in Orlando and Jacksonville were all about keeping the public safe and engaging that way and helping the public in terms of what ended up, they were spared, but that's really what our engagement is all about. And I would say it is on digital, but it's more about in person. It's more about getting people together. So for example, in Dayton, which had that horrific mass shooting, we have a television newspaper station and radio stations there, and they just the other night they had a forum about the shooting and had on mental health experts, the governor, and that's really what our engagement is about. And that's what I think about commenting selectively. It's those types of things where I think it would be good to selectively allow comments about digitally and then monitor them that way.
Interesting. Okay. Karla, anything else?
No, I think for us on the marketing side, it's really a brand by brand basis. You know, if you're a big brand that gets a million responses on something a day, I think we've got those that just tend to ignore them at this point. There's so many to keep up with that they just ignore them. And then we've got smaller brands where they address. And I say they because they keep their social media in-house. A lot of times they've got social media agencies running for them, but for these particular clients, they like to take it in-house because, again, if it escalates, at least it's already internally and they take care of it that way. But it really is more on a case-by-case basis or brand-by-brand basis on how they respond. And a lot of them say if it's a brand-related comment, even though it might be a bad comment, we can address it because it is about the brand. But once you start putting something else completely different that's not about balloons, then it's just ignored. And then obviously the smaller ones, it's a growing brand, and so you want to respond to every single one and address them and ask the question and say, I'm sorry, this is not the content we like. Thank you so much for following us, or what that might be. So it really is on a case-by-case basis or brand.
Great. Any other questions? All right. Well, I'm going to go to one more slide. So I thought it would just be good to sort of summarize a few of the things that we've talked about today. So I think anticipating, so here's some of the ways that you can deal with incivility, right, and sort of manage it. Anticipate audience reactions. So I think, again, understanding who it is that you're speaking to, understanding how they will interpret the content that you're putting out there and the conversation that will start so that you can anticipate reactions. Pairing technology with human moderation. So yes, technology is great. Being able to block or unfollow or remove comments or things like that on platforms is great, but it does require a level of human interaction. Knowing when to respond and when not to. So again, trying not to feed the trolls and sort of bring all of their negativity to the top of the feed and make that the focus of what's happening. And figuring out sort of how do you respond succinctly and in a way that addresses the concern but doesn't continue to escalate the problem. Making your code of conduct clear. So again, whether you have a commenting system on your own site that you're going to continue to maintain and you're going to open that forum up for people, or if it is your social media channels, there is an opportunity for you to establish sort of the rules of the road for the community that you're building in that space. Making it really hard to hide by getting rid of anonymous posting. So this is another thing that I know Lolly touched on, was Facebook allows us to sort of, at least for the most part, tie a face and a name to all the comments being made. Sure, there's like fake accounts, but that's a pretty insignificant number of what's happening. So the more times you can sort of make people not hide behind an avatar, the better. And of course, on-site commenting systems enable you to do that, either by connecting through like a Facebook connection or by having your own registration system in place. Empowering your audience and allowing them to police others. Again, you're building a community, so bring them into the conversation. They want to keep people accountable and want to make it a place that they will enjoy. So give them some of the tools that they need to be able to report other community members who aren't adhering to the code of standards that you've laid out. And then show your community that you care and that you're accountable, right? So that goes back to, you want to make sure that you're addressing the concerns. A lot of time it's just something that someone wants to know that they're being heard. So make sure that you've addressed that, and also show the people who are exhibiting positive behavior that you're not going to tolerate the negative behavior by removing those people from the community if it comes to that. Make sense? Anything else? All right, great. Lolly.
I know I've talked a lot, but I do feel compelled to say one thing, because I don't know how many people are journalists in this room, but I do think this is kind of applicable across our many different fields. One of the things that I've had to become sensitive to is that because I write about people and their lives, is alerting them to the possibility that after a story is published in the paper or after it's published online, that people will hunt them down on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram, and just kind of making sure that they have a heightened awareness that there's the possibility that people will then come looking for them because they want to see more photos or they want to learn more about this person, that it can invite strangers into your social media life that you weren't expecting, in an effort to kind of prep them for what they're gonna encounter.
That's great. That's great advice.
How has that impacted your stories? Have you had people that say, okay, I'm not going to talk to you?
No, I've never had people kind of turn down, because I've had people turn down being interviewed, or who don't want to share their stories. The people who are compelled to share their stories, it's a great privilege to tell their stories. And so most of the time they're committed to sharing with the public. But in this case, it's again just preparing them that they may be flooded by interest in their Facebook or interest in their social media. For some people, that has meant shutting down their social media or privatizing their pages, because they may not want to be contacted individually. Not all of the attention that you get on social media or the access that you get on social media is positive. So it's just essentially so that they're not caught off guard when, the story runs and they get a certain amount of attention out in the public, but then they go back to their Facebook page and there are all these comments on their page. So it's just really just an attempt to kind of prepare them for what's going to happen after a story is published.
Have people had that
Yes.
happen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In good and bad ways.
Great. And I'm going to add one thing to what Ollie said, and actually ask you another thing that's just reminded me of it. So that's sort of prepping your subjects and the people that you're writing about. How about for reporters in the room or anyone who's thinking about entering that field, and the sort of attention that reporters get, and sort of how to manage that? Because that was another piece we talked about, is like a troll loves to go after a person's name, right?
Yeah, and so it's something that when you go into communications or when you go into this field, that's just now a part of it. When I started Facebook, I can't remember the year, but initially when I set up my account, it was before it was really a media tool. So it was a way to keep in touch with people that I went to high school with and people that I went to college with. That was the initial community. So that was before it really spread into this whole other world that includes the entire world, right? So one of my first sort of eye-awakening experiences is when readers would go to my Facebook page, and now they're engaging with my social life. right? And they would comment. So they may see a photo of me at a party, and I would get comments, I didn't know you were that type of person. And, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what's happening here? And my initial Facebook page was not tied to my work email account. Some of them were very critical because I like to go to live shows. So there were some readers that would come to my page and they were very critical about who I like to see perform. It felt extremely intrusive. And then I had to adjust and tailor my page for professional reasons, because what I realized, people saw your byline in the paper. Now it has become secondhand to then go to social media and search you down, right? Or when people saw me appear on CNN to talk about a news story, well, now they're looking at the social media avenues to kind of hunt me down. And I'm, again, one of the people who adopted the technology so early that I didn't anticipate it, and so I just had to learn along the way. And I think that's what we're all doing. And so I tell young journalists or people who are just entering the field or transitioning into the field that this is something that you have to be aware of and be careful about. But again, it's not just us who are out in the public. Brands like Dove soap are using members of the public to kind of advertise and say, oh, I like this product. Well, just because they only used your first name in the ad and your face doesn't mean that you are anonymous. Now people are searching you down because they saw your image and now they want to find out more about you. And they are on your Facebook page. They are on your social media pages looking for you and trying to place you. So you have to be aware that there is an appetite from the public to kind of look for you, and that they will be critical based on what they see.
And they're doing some great, and they're doing some great stuff. We want them to be discussing this with others. But sometimes, and this is my personal experience, that when we encourage them to get on social media, either they're already on social media, they're on it for social reasons, and they don't want to bring their work into it, or they aren't on social media, they don't want to deal with it, and they don't want to get on it. So when you were talking about, I kind of had to adjust. I've had that conversation with faculty members before that, like, okay, well, maybe you're going to have to adjust the way you're using this tool if you want to promote your brand, your research, your work. And they seem to shut down. They don't want to make that change. So is there any better way to kind of sell this idea of, hey, it's okay, you can make this change, like it won't be that bad? Does that question make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. And my answer is this is not a corporate answer, because I think these are streets that we're all still trying to navigate and figure our way around the map. I personally feel that social media engagement as an individual is something that you should be able to opt into or opt out of. I'm engaged because I choose to be a member of the reporting press. And when I went into this field, I knew that I had to be accessible by the public, that they need to be able to reach me in order to sell stories. In that situation, and even as a media organization, the Tribune opens up its website to our sources and our tools as a platform, right? So instead of you having to engage this conversation on your personal social media pages, you can have this conversation via the chicagotribune.com social media pages, or through the tools that we have available in order to engage the public. And it is very sensitive, because one of the things they encourage us to do at work is to post our stories on Facebook. I am sometimes reluctant to post my stories because I know my friends get tired of it, right? I'm like, I really only have like 600 Facebook friends, and these are my friends. These are like people I went to school with, and they're not opening this story. Like I go back and I look at the story and it's got like, 700 likes, so to speak. Everyone has liked it, but it's got 0 shares. right? And that's because it's like, as an audience, you've kind of worn them down from it being all about you. So sometimes it's even more productive and better when I'm on the Chicago Tribune Facebook page and I can have a conversation with our audience through that, because I know this is an audience that is in Chicago or touched by our products and truly want to engage with it. It's not my friends from DC or my friends from Knoxville, Tennessee or New York who are like, we have no idea how this is relevant to us, right? So sometimes that's an avenue, is making the school's website or the school's Facebook or social media pages accessible to those professors to say, we're going to have a conversation on Twitter about X, Y, and Z, and you don't have to contact me on my personal page. We'll have it here.
Yeah, so that's what we all grapple with that, and it's the same kind of thing, and we've done the same thing where it's accessible through the product pages as opposed to their personal pages. However, there are definitely some that are better than others, and what I would suggest you have to do is, and it's not easy, is try to figure out a way to hold people accountable and say, this is part of your responsibility is to engage with the community, and here are our expectations. And even then, it doesn't necessarily is a guarantee, but at least setting some standards and saying it is part of this is something to think about. If you haven't already done that.
Yeah. At Meredith, it comes up all the time too, right? Because you've got, a zillion editors and they're all on social media channels for their own personal use, but those are some pretty public people in a lot of cases. And so we sort of tier, right? So we have a set of standards and expectations around our editors-in-chief or our other lead content creators, the people who are really, really out there in the public a lot. And there's sort of some guidelines in general for Meredith around how we as employees will conduct ourselves in social media spaces. And we every now and then we do have instances where we have to go to someone and say, this thing you did is not appropriate. And you need to either remove it now and you need to not repeat this behavior in the future. And those are challenging conversations because a lot of them do see it as their own personal space, but it does have a reflection on our brands and our company. So it's something they all sort of agree to sign up for when they accept employment. So.
Melissa, I'm going to use the power of the mic to ask my own question,
Sounds
actually. And it's a bit of a shift from what we're talking about. So thanks, everyone, for the comments. We asked you to address this human interaction part and how we keep our audiences. But we all know that there's technology out there that allows someone to create an audience and a person without really a person being behind that. An algorithm for when there are certain words in your stories to place comments that are not really placed by a person. So I'm just very curious about how we think about that as a profession in relation to First Amendment rights, incendiary speech, and incivility, and then how the three panelists are dealing with that from their organizations.
Sure. I think that's a really big question. And I'll answer at least a little bit from my perspective, and then you guys can jump in too. I think that is something that happens a lot more prevalently on social media channels. We don't see as much of that happening on our O&O channels, so our owned and operated sites. Within the social media channels, again, I think that's where we do heavily rely on the platforms to be putting in some sort of technology solutions that are going to help us with weeding out that sort of that faux account kind of stuff and the activity that is really designed just to create incendiary conversations. It doesn't mean that it doesn't still have to have some level of human moderation, again, which can be overwhelming. I admit that at Meredith, most of the content that we publish is not so controversial that we're dealing with that all the time. So we haven't really had to, deal with a big barrage of attacks from a bunch of fake accounts. That happens probably a lot more in the news space. But do you guys want to dive in a little bit on that?
Well, for me, I haven't encountered it firsthand. Again, I think that we anticipate whether a story is going to drive that type of response. So, for example, some political stories, even when we post them on Facebook, we won't allow comments for fear of that. I have seen cases where there have been comments and then there's a note under the comment from one of the administrators or that's generated through technology that says this is likely a computer-generated response. And so we don't delete the response, but it at least kind of flags the public to know that this may have been produced by a fraudulent or an account that can't be trusted.
So I'm not aware that we've had that issue. However, it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. I think it's a good note for 2020, but I think the expectation is that, and it's been publicly written about, that it's the social media platforms that ultimately have the responsibility to make sure that their platforms aren't invaded by fake bots or accounts. And but I think we need to keep an eye out for it.
I just have a quick question. It's kind of off topic, but now that you're publishing more established codes of conduct, you're trying to focus more on valid criticism. Have you noticed any change in advertising dollars or the types of companies? Have you seen any brands or advertisers that have come to you because they feel that the site is more positive, or have you potentially lost some advertisers as you've gotten more into the code of conduct and that type of thing?
I'm going to speak to, I'll speak to that just a little bit, and then I'm going to look at Dave Kearns over there and see if he has anything to add. So I think, again, generally, the Meredith sites don't necessarily incite a lot of, like, a frenzy of negative activity. We're pretty fortunate there. Doesn't mean that there haven't been instances where things have gone awry or controversial topics come up. By and large, though, I haven't necessarily seen a shift in advertisers saying, hey, great, you're creating a safe space. I think Meredith has always been seen as a relatively safe space and a group of trusted brands. And so we have that strong trust with our advertiser partners. But of course, most advertisers I know want nothing to do with being around UGC content that is unmoderated or community forums or things like that, because that is not a space that they trust. And then I think as we push more and more into distributed platforms like YouTube or things, then we deal with it there as well, as like how much can we control and create a trusted environment for our brands on other platforms where we can't control all the activity or put technology solutions in place or things like that, and how much do we have to rely on those platforms to create safe spaces. Dave, anything? All right.
I haven't really seen any shift based on that. I mean, if there has been any shift in advertising dollars, it's more to continue to get into the internet and social media and all of that. But it has really not. White Castle is probably our largest client, and they, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with White Castle, but their following is probably a younger, they still have a actually older consumer that, was born and raised with White Castle and sits there with their coffee every morning and sees these crazy kids come in, still out of the club at 7 a.m.
You just made me hungry.
But they really, they get every comment and anything that you could possibly hear and see and listen to, but it really has not made them shift any dollars or more or less. They just, their strategy just continues to be more out there for this generation that is very technology savvy. But they're still, even as big company they are, they're still trying to manage all of this because it's crazy.
And one last thing, and then I think I'm being told that we're about at time. But I think the one thing that I think still holds true is that all of our advertising partners want to understand that we have a strong connection with our consumers, right? So it's not necessarily about proving that we're creating a safe space, but showing that we have that connection and that we have a good, strong feedback loop, and that it's something that's really valued as part of what we're doing and how we're building our brands, I think that is always trusted and relied on. So, great. All right, with that, I'll bring us to a close. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.